and welcome everyone to this special Cyber Dialogue event today on the topic of significant importance to our region, defending, deterring and disrupting cybercrime. I'd like to start, as is customary in Australia, by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're recording today, but also around Australia and New Zealand, and indeed wherever our listeners are coming from as well. I'm Katherine Mansted, the Director of Cyber Intelligence and Public Policy at CyberCX, and I'm incredibly privileged to be joined by perhaps two of the greatest minds in the world on the topic that we're talking about. So we have in the studio today, or indeed virtually with us in the studio today, Ciaran Martin, who was the inaugural Chief Executive of the National Cybersecurity Centre in the UK, and in some respects his counterpart, who was the inaugural head of the Australian Cybersecurity Centre in Australia a couple of years after Ciaran's debut. But both of them are by no means one-trick ponies. So Ciaran, in addition to over 20 years of public service in the UK, is now a Professor of Practice at the Blavatnik School of Government at Oxford University. Alastair MacGibbon, here on my right, is of course the Chief Strategy Officer at CyberCX, but has a storied career through cybersecurity in both the private sector and in the public sector in Australia as well. So I'm incredibly excited to be able to have a conversation with both of you today. And I might kick off straight away with a first question to Ciaran, which is to say, one of the things that we've been focusing on in our work a lot is, of course, ransomware. And I've heard you say before that in some respects, ransomware has gone from being perhaps an underappreciated risk to our national security and also to our organisations around the world, to almost the question of the minute where it's hard to even open a newspaper these days without seeing a story about ransomware. And of course, we know that on the front lines in Australia and New Zealand, it's a day-to-day reality and risk that organisations are thinking about. So my first question, Ciaran, to you is, how worried should we be about ransomware? What's the scale of the threat? And is there any good news on the horizon in terms of it potentially dropping off of late, or is it really the new normal that we're living with?
Thanks, Katherine. Good morning, evening. Thanks for having me. Great question. I will try not to spend the rest of the hour or the rest of the session answering it. But I think, firstly, what's happened in 2021 is that ransomware has come into the open because it used to be around what you might call the quiet extortion of companies, mostly wealthy companies, but most people didn't notice it. Now, I'll give you an example from this week here in the UK. I was on the BBC yesterday morning and the presenter said to me, yesterday I tried to pay my elderly mother's newspaper subscription bill at the local Spar newsagents, and I couldn't because 600 stores in the north of England had been taken out by ransomware. You're seeing real social disruption. Colonial Pipeline in the US leading to fuel shortages. The Irish healthcare crisis, the first ever targeted attack I know of a national healthcare system, vaccine bookings in Rome, food being thrown out in Swedish co-op schools disrupted in England, and so forth. So I think for the first time, cybercrime is really coming to hit people's everyday lives, and often because of the prevalence of it in areas like healthcare in ways that are actually quite dangerous. So it's very worrying. For all the talk in the past about cyber war and so forth, I think 2021 and ransomware, these criminals who are just after money, has really brought home our sort of cyber vulnerabilities. So it is something that we should be deeply worried about, particularly given what's happened. Also because, Alastair can speak for himself, but certainly when I was running operations in the UK, we would try to get people to assess their threat properly. So some people, the Russian state might be interested in your organization, but they weren't interested in everything. Ransomware can be interested in pretty much anybody with money, which is most of us in most organizations. So pretty much everyone's at risk. So you're looking for good news. I'm not sure there's been a dip. Certainly in the UK, we've had perhaps a slightly easier year until quite recently, and there've been a couple of really quite difficult incidents in the UK of late. But the good news is, if you go back to the summer, the G7 summit with other organizations, including representatives from Australia and so forth, are there. And you have ransomware in a leader's declaration from a G7 summit. Now, if Al and I go back to when we were working together in about 2018, the odds you'd have got on ransomware making an appearance, a high-profile appearance in a G7 leaders summit communique, would have been laughably small. So it's got policymakers' attention. And if you look at, say, the US-led approach, there are several aspects to it. There's putting diplomatic pressure on Russia, long-term game, see how it goes. There's going after the money. I've been pleasantly surprised that there's now 30 nations, including the two that we're talking about, the UK and Australia, working very hard on that. There's actually a law enforcement and offensive cyber response, tactical but worth doing. So those three things are happening. But the real thing of deep value is hardening our own defenses. Again, that's really long term. It's really hard. Some of it's quite dull. Not all of it is. But the most important thing we can do is just make this a less profitable business. That means making it harder. This isn't the most sophisticated type of cyber attack. So it's a deeply frustrating problem in some ways, because in a sense, we can make it a bit too easy for the criminals. But maybe, just maybe, if we can keep this momentum from the summer going across those four strands, and particularly that last strand of hardening our own defenses, we can start to make this problem less grand in scale and less harmful in terms of that social disruption. We've got a long way to go.
Alastair, I might bring you in at this point. So Ciaran's emphasised the importance of organisations hardening their own defences, but you've been on the record talking about the way in which Australia is an incredibly permissive environment for cyber criminals. And I assume you don't just mean because organisations aren't stepping up to the plate. Is Australia taking the lead that it needs to take when it comes to pursuing those diplomatic, law enforcement, policy measures that Ciaran was highlighting are coming from the US? Or does it not matter because Australia's less powerful and important than the US, and all of this will be determined by what US policy does, not Australia?
Well, in short, you know my answer is no, governments aren't doing enough. And I'm going to say they're not doing enough anywhere in the world, but I'm going to say I can forgive them for it because this has been fast moving. I know that's a cliched phrase. I mean, Ciaran and I used to debate a little bit about what role cybercrime plays versus nation-state threat actors and the impact it has on national security. And we all know I call it an existential threat because I think it could be, right? I mean, certainly for individuals and for key parts of our society, this is an increasing threat. So having said that I forgive them, I won't for long if governments don't take more action. I don't know if that makes sense. So when I talk about a permissive environment, Ciaran, I'd love your views on this, is if I think about any other type of crime, if this was another crime that was as rampantly impactful upon just anyone in society, we'd expect governments, police forces and central governments and regional governments to be taking pretty significant action. You would expect global action, you expect a lot of local action. We're starting to see it. To your point, you would never expect a G7 communique on a cybercrime or a crime of any sort, really, maybe some time ago, and you know, a drug trade or something. But so I think there's improvements, but there's a lot to go, Katherine. I was going to ask you a question, if I could kind of rudely steal your question as chair. Ciaran, we did see a little dip during the northern summer in ransomware, and some people attributed that to the actions being taken by governments. I actually put it down to probably Eastern European criminals taking a well-earned summer holiday that they couldn't take the year before because of COVID. What's your view on that? So again, when I say well-earned, no criminal actually earns their living, and I would just, for anyone that reacts to this thinking I somehow think that they deserve a break, they don't, and we should go after them. But I thought maybe because the year before they all had such a dreadful northern summer where all the lockdowns were happening and then things opened up, and I thought they just went off and spent their ill-gotten gains for a while. Now they're back on the tools.
So the short answer is we don't really know. They do give media interviews, but tend to be sort of self-aggrandizing ones, so they don't really talk about their lifestyles, although some British journalists have done some really good work tracking down their fast cars and so on. I think it's a very plausible theory, the sort of going on holiday theory, because for several years, and you and I watched this together when we were in operational leadership roles in government, that period of the year did tend to see an abatement in the level of activity. I think that's probably one of the factors. Other factors were there might have been a bit of Russian state direction to lie low for a bit, and the disruption of individual gangs will have kept some of the more prolific ones a bit quieter for a while. Although, as I'm sure we'll come on to, that sort of tactical disruption is a bit, can be a bit whack-a-mole. It's useful, but it's not a strategic solution. Just on your point about the nature of this threat, I mean, you're being wonderfully, and if I can, be slightly, hopefully pleasantly provocative, perhaps uncharacteristically diplomatic. Mac, first of all, you've been quite forgiving, and secondly, you're referring to discussions we had. I mean, I think the proper word, given that Australians we're talking to, is arguments and rows, and I've conceded before that you were broadly right and I was wrong. I think, and 2021 has proved you right, because for all the talk about state threats, and of course they mattered profoundly. They're quite complicated. The Chinese challenge, the Russian challenge, very different, and so forth. But the thing that's actually come closest to hurting people, killing people potentially, is criminality. The issue, I think it's hard, and we should discuss this, is you're right in that a problem of this scale, of this global impact, would normally get that sort of coordinated law enforcement action. There's one difference, you may disagree, but there's one difference about the nature of the crime, which is, I think you could say that for the first time in human history, you can inflict that large-scale damage on other countries as far away from each other as our two countries, from a place like Russia. And you can do it entirely without anyone, you or your accomplices, ever setting foot in the territory. And that does mean that that aspect of the problem is harder, not impossible, but harder, and requires a slightly different approach. And I'd be interested in your views on that, but we can go wherever you like with this conversation.
No, so that's not fair. But go on.
Well, you've brought up the notion of some disagreement between the two of you, and I want to kind of stoke that out a bit further, because I know one issue, and in fact it's a key issue when it comes to ransomware policy. It's not the only issue, but it is a key issue, is should you pay a ransom, and should governments potentially ban a ransom? And Ciaran, I know you've written a number of pieces on this. I'm thinking about your Brookings piece, for instance, and others, where you talk about I guess your in principle desire to ban paying ransoms, whereas Alastair, you have on the public record made some comments around the idea of, well, if you ban ransoms, or ban the paying of ransoms, you're potentially just taking away one option that victims have in their toolkit when they're potentially having the worst day of their lives. So can I draw you both out on that? And I'll start with Ciaran. What's your view, and how's it evolved when it comes to the question whether we should be stepping in and preventing organisations from paying ransoms, which ultimately, of course, furnish the coffers of cyber criminals?
Well, let me just say where I start from. So I start from the fact that normally it's not lawful to transfer money to criminals. We have a range of measures against that. So the starting point I would have is prohibit it unless there are compelling reasons not to do it, rather than put the burden of proof on those who would wish to keep it relatively easy to pay ransoms. So, and there's one thing to pick up on, I think, where I would agree certainly in tone with what Alastair has said, in that I would be reasonably critical of public policymakers around the world, and that I don't think we're examining it closely enough. We're not actually doing the hard technical work to say, well, it might push people underground, it's victim blaming. Okay, where's the hard, realistic, consultative, inclusive study that gives you some evidence that actually examines whether or not this would work? And I think that's really, really important in terms of getting something useful. Secondly, I've never said that banning ransom would do anything particularly useful. That's the nature of the Brookings piece that you referenced, Katherine. It would have to be part of a wider package. And I think part of that package is we have the minute, and this is an accident, but it's a very damaging accident. We have allowed a pro-criminal narrative to take root in the minds of executives and leaders who are faced with this horrible, awful crisis where they need support and sympathy. And the narrative goes as follows: you've been done over, it's existential, and the way out is to pay. Now, the second and third part of that, it's existential and the only way out is to pay, are often not true. It's very damaging, but it's not always the case that you're going to be completely done over. You're going to go out of business or whatever. You're not going to be able to treat any hospital payments. It may be highly disruptive, but it's not the same thing as being existential. And secondly, in the words of many cybersecurity experts, paying a ransom is not a magic flick back on switch. Ransomware attacks batter computers. Even if you get the decryptor key and it works, it still takes time. So actually, even if you take the morality out of it, the ethics, the general public policy out of it, paying is often not a particularly effective way out of it. But that's not what the general business leadership community, who don't pay as much attention to these issues as the three of us do, that's what they often think. So we've got to change the narrative of this, and I think part of this is, given the problem I just said about the hardness it is, how hard it is to reach these criminals, all the attention needs to be on disrupting their business model. So let's look at some serious public policy options to stop the flow of money. So for example, and I'll stop talking soon, I promise, one argument I've heard that I've no truck with at all is that, you shouldn't criminalize, or you shouldn't prohibit ransom payments. It doesn't necessarily have to be criminal law, it could be civil. You should instead just have transparency arrangements around cryptocurrency payments. Why? Because people say, well, it would be easy to evade and push it underground if you banned ransom payments. Well, exactly the same is true of cryptocurrency payments. So let's, in my view, just do the hard analysis. They've got 30 countries working on this following the G7 and so forth. Let's work out what would be the most effective public policy. I don't think these are issues of high principle. They're issues of what works. And where I am critical of governments is that operational agencies, such as the ones we used to head, can only do so much. You need economics, legal ministries, and so on to be looking at this, both within country and between countries, to work out what works. And I don't think we're doing that yet.
Can I just ask, before I go to Alastair, a potentially cheeky follow-up, Ciaran? So we mentioned Colonial Pipeline before. That was a major ransomware attack earlier this year that disrupted energy supply on the east coast of America. Colonial Pipeline paid a cool $4.4 million ransom to their attackers, a tax-deductible ransom. If you were, and it's difficult to imagine oneself in the victim's shoes, but if you were in the victim's shoes in that case, thinking about whether to pay or not pay, would you have been inclined to make the same decision that Colonial Pipeline did?
Well, Colonial, it's hard to put myself in that position. So let me say something that you might think is evading the question, but it's, I hope, an equally provocative answer. Colonial did nothing wrong, certainly nothing illegal, but I think Colonial, and certainly some of the US healthcare cases, show how we've completely misaligned incentives and the governance of response. So what Colonial did, if you take two things Colonial did, which they were perfectly entitled to do, one was they switched off the pipeline. They didn't have to. The pipeline, it was understood, was workable. It just wasn't economic to run it with the systems being battered. And secondly, they paid the ransom. They did both of those things without consultation, it seems, with the US federal government. But the US federal government then had to manage all the consequences of that, the disruption to fuel supply and so forth. And if you transfer this onto healthcare and say, let's compare the US and Ireland, right? So in the US, individual hospitals are private, and nobody's going to change that. So if you're in the position of a chief exec of a hospital and you get hit by ransomware, to whom are your duties? To your board of directors and your patients, right? So you are incentivized to pay because of that narrative and that impression that the only way to do your duty to your patients and your board of directors is to pay. If you take Ireland, where the commissioning, the body that got hacked, was a public authority, it was taken at cabinet level by the elected government. Who is their duty to? The whole of the Irish state. So they take a whole of society view as to what the balance of interest is, and they decide not to pay. So in an American hospital, the decision on to pay the ransom, for those who remember the drama House, is taken by Dr. Cuddy. In Ireland, or in Britain, when we were hit in 2017, it's taken by the Prime Minister and the Cabinet. So what we have at the minute in these cases, because both the pipeline and the healthcare issues in the US and in Europe, and so in continental Europe, are national security risks. Disrupting healthcare through crime is a national security risk, but we've privatized the decision taking. And so every actor is taking entirely rational decisions based on their incentives, accountabilities, and responsibilities. But that often isn't working. And that's what we've got to fix. We are, in too many cases, I think, privatizing national security risks. That doesn't mean nationalizing US healthcare. I'm not advocating that because I'm not mad, I hope. But it does mean rethinking how we do these things. And certainly, I think the Colonial case is a classic where the company took commercial decisions it's entirely entitled to take, offloaded the whole of the management of the crisis, then the consequences of it, onto the shoulders of the American taxpayer public and US federal authorities. That can't be the right way to manage it.
Alastair, do the boardrooms of Australia look a bit different to the boardrooms of America when it comes to stepping through these decisions in your experience? I know you do a lot of work with executives when it comes to thinking about this $1 million question, do you pay ransom? And in your experience, is it something that a company takes lightly?
Well, that, to Ciaran's point, no one takes paying a criminal lightly, right? And you know, if I had a choice of do you pay or don't pay, the answer is always you don't, right? With a comma afterwards that then goes into all of the bits of is anyone going to die? But I really like Ciaran's question about or challenge about the privatising of those decisions, where it is rational perhaps to the individual actor, but the social and national security consequences are much broader. I think we've not yet, and again, this goes to that point that for some reason we've allowed these cyber issues to be treated fundamentally differently to a lot of other issues that we have started to see the broader social, economic, moral impacts. But we haven't yet with cyber. I think we will. I think it's a match. I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but there's a maturation here, and it's a rapid maturation. Colonial Pipeline was a classic example. Nothing illegal about doing it. Probably quite rational if you're the business. I'm going to try 2 or 3 or 4 methods to make sure that I can be operational. It kind of makes sense. But to Ciaran's point, who else makes those decisions? And that go. So I strip all this back, right? And say, in a permissive threat environment where threat actors without any cost or very little cost and very low consequences can just do as they please to individual businesses and entities, then you've really got a situation where all parts of the equation are wrong. And I think that what has to happen, you've got to drain this swamp as I start mixing analogies, which I'm renowned for, so I'll probably swip partway through. Ciaran, keep up. Got to drain this swamp first, make it less permissive, push cost into criminals and threat actors more broadly. Then we take some of the heat out of the swamp that's now drained. It probably gets hotter, actually, I don't know. But like you drain this swamp, make it less permissive. Then you start regulating, things like having to report to government when you've had an incident. I also like the sort of reporting to government when you've had near misses, a bit like the aircraft or airline industry. They don't just report crashes because they're usually front page news anyway. They report when planes get close to hitting each other in the air and you conduct an inquiry. We need to get to that standard. People might think that's crazy. How can you, with so many connected systems that are just pervasive throughout our lives and our economies? And I say, well, that makes all the more reason for us to do that. When we get to that level, then the individual questions and decisions made by companies become more social. Now, we've seen legislation passed in this country, first half, a 2-part process for security of critical infrastructure, where, I was asked this question yesterday on radio. You run a power station, for example, you're not just running I think this is to Ciaran's point, you're not just running a power station that you're responsible to your shareholders and the people that consume your power. You're a critical infrastructure provider. And so the decisions you make have bigger consequences. And we've just not had that nuanced discussion. And it really surprises me. We see, and I will shut up, these screaming headlines of risk and very little thoughtful analysis of what policy levers, what security levers should we be taking as a society. And then I think to one of the points Ciaran made, what do you do to individually defend yourself? And I just, as a former police officer, just keep going back to what's the role of the citizen in fighting crime? And preventing crime occurring to them, and what role has society to play. And we kind of got that right. We imported a police system, the peelers, into Australia. And as liberal Western democracies, we've kind of got those levers, and they're not just the cops, but the laws and the way in which people act when they're on a public street and everything else. We need to bring that same set of consciousness to our internet connected devices. Then we really start getting a much more nuanced debate, and I think a much safer environment. How do we go from anarchic self-decisions in your own interest, fighting criminals who can reach towards us from overseas and never having actually physically touched us, but can harm us, to this concept of a rule of law, liberal Western democratic society, where it's just a crime type, and how quickly can we do it? That's the question I think we should be addressing as participants in this. I'm not sure if I answered your question.
Well, I'll throw another one back at you. You mentioned the security of critical infrastructure reforms. Critical infrastructure is a buzzword that in both of our countries, the government's very much focused on protecting. We've been speaking a lot about the cybercrime threat to critical infrastructure. It was a ransomware gang that hit Colonial Pipeline, and we know that critical infrastructure in Australia is under constant threat from cybercrime. But in the course of debating those SOCI reforms in our parliament, our security and intelligence heads made a great point of talking about the nation-state threat, and in particular talking about the risk that nation-state threat actors would potentially be accessing our critical infrastructure to pre-position for future attack. So as we spend all this time talking about cybercrime and ransomware, is it possible that we're missing the strategic forest for the tactical, immediate trees in front of us, to mix metaphors, by focusing on ransomware, but missing this bigger picture of global instability in cyberspace and the potential that our critical infrastructure could come under a deliberate, destructive, non-financially motivated geopolitical attack?
Wow. Do you want me to start, Ciaran? Okay. I'd say, well, of course. I mean, why wouldn't nation states pre-position? I think but I'll put a caveat. The likelihood of a nation state doing anything to Australia, so I'm just going to talk in the Australian context, and I'd probably say the UK as well, because of its sort of, I'm going to call it benign position in the world. I'm not sure if that's the right phrase. Smarter people in the room can fix that for me. The likelihood of a nation state doing something to us in just a cyber form, crippling critical infrastructure to harm us, is very low, right? Because they understand the consequences of doing that, and it's just not, it's not right, if that makes sense. If I was the Ukraine and I was in a territorial dispute with Russia, would I expect the state of Russia to do that in the Ukraine? Of course, we've seen them do it. And on it goes with pretty much anyone who's got a territorial dispute with the Russians. We're not necessarily nice players on the internet. Or if I was Israel and Iran, or anyone who deals with North Korea, you'd expect them to be a bit less responsible, and I think they are less responsible. But would other nations who see themselves as strategic competitors to us pre-position for if there was an armed conflict, or we were in a less benign environment, if things were more malignant and there were disputes and people wanted to shape the political discourse, why wouldn't you use cyber means? So I'm not, trying to beat some drum. I'm not trying to make it problematic, but yes, it's a legitimate weapon of war now to use cyber means.
Should we be calm about pre-positioning then and say, oh well, we're all in each other's networks?
Because I used to describe it as the equivalent of a foreign state coming in and putting charges underneath key bridges and electricity pylons. You'd never allow a foreign nation to come in and do that, or put poison on doorknobs, right, Ciaran? You'd rail against it. Mm-hmm. And the UK have seen physical acts of that type of egregious nation-state activity. We see it a lot less in Australia. Thank goodness, we're very lucky that way. But could people pre-position? And should we therefore be, sorry for hitting the mic, should we be careful and concerned and go and hunt for that? Absolutely. Sorry, that's a long answer, Ciaran. I'm not sure if you agree with my answer.
Can I throw it back to Ciaran with an addition on what you just said, to bring a UK flavour in? So we saw a couple of months ago in announcing the new UK National Cyber Force headquarters in Lancashire, the UK Defence Secretary made some comments around critical infrastructure and offensive cyber. So when posed the question, would the UK have the capability to hit back at critical infrastructure if the UK was hit? The Defence Secretary made comments to the effect of, well, of course, we'd have those capabilities. So are we all as bad as one another here, A? And B, when it comes to thinking about offensive cyber as a deterrent, do we need to be careful in our messaging? Are we at risk of escalating in the cyber domain to a point where we don't want to be?
So I'll come to that. I just want to pick up a couple of things that you asked Alastair and his response about the nation state threat in the light of ransomware. So first of all, I agree with Alastair's comments about the likelihood of the threat. So when the Irish healthcare system was hit and all the hallmarks were that it was an attack from Russia, no serious cybersecurity expert or geopolitical expert thought for a second it was Russian state directed. What on earth would they have suddenly hit the Irish healthcare system for? But having said all that, the vulnerability exposed by all these hacks and the disruption will not have been lost on nation states. The fact that it was quite easy to get a pipeline switched off, the fact that a healthcare system was crippled, I think will not have been lost on them. So we shouldn't be relaxed about pre-positioning. The problem with tackling pre-positioning is that it's done stealthily, so it is quite hard to detect. And when you do detect it, you can't ask the exploit what it's doing there because it's a piece of code, and you can't ask who put it there because they won't tell you. So it may be there for espionage purposes. It may be there for potentially more malevolent future purposes. The good news on the protections is that sort of resilience that we're talking about in terms of hardening our defenses works for both. It works for the criminal threat and it works for the nation state threat in terms of severe disruption. So actually, and a lot of this is non-cyber. How do you keep a healthcare commissioning system going if you lose access to your main network? How do you, in the light of Colonial, because Colonial basically should undermine our confidence in all those assurances that you always get from critical infrastructure hardware operators, that their operating technology is fully segregated from their normal enterprise system, which clearly it isn't, and in many cases it's not. So how do you build, how do you plan for the loss of key bits of the network? How do you build new networks to make sure there aren't single points of vulnerability? That works for both ransomware and the nation state threat in terms of countering disruption. Then, and I don't know if Alastair agrees with me, I know that plenty of people in the British government don't, but I'm free to speak my mind. On the offensive capability side, I think we risk actually overdoing this because we're not all as bad as each other. So I actually think that one of the most powerful ways in which we can use offensive cyber is against the infrastructure of ransomware type criminals rather than nation states. So Alastair mentioned poison on doorknobs and, alluding to the horrific Salisbury attack in the UK. That's a really good way of thinking about it, because when the Russians did that extraordinary, completely beyond the bounds of acceptable behavior attack chemical weapons in the UK in 2018, what was the UK response? The one thing that was never considered was a retaliatory chemical weapons attack on Russian civilians. Why on earth would a country like the UK do something like that? So if there is some sort of disruption of, so if you take this time last year when the US was rightly very upset by the revelations of the SolarWinds hack by the Russian state, there were quite a lot of hot-headed people on Capitol Hill calling for cyber retaliation against Russia. Let's unpack that a bit. What would that mean? Are you going to do retaliatory spying? Well, that's nonsensical. I mean, spying is spying. Are you going to disrupt the Russian state media? Well, you can, but what message are you sending? Are you going to disrupt Russian healthcare in response to an espionage operation? So I think we can overdo this deterrence. There was an example in the UK. Some anonymous source briefed one of our major newspapers after the death of a British national in Iran, and it wasn't true, but it was just this sort of hype that you get. Said that the cabinet had authorized a retaliatory cyber strike on Iran, and the quote was, "We're going to hit them in ways that people here won't notice, but they'll get the message." I mean, that doesn't make any sense. So I think there's a bit of offensive cyber Kool-Aid on the sort of, deterring all the state stuff. It's a capability. It can be used against terrorists. It can be used against child sex offenders in hard to reach territories. It can be used against ransomware criminals. Use it wherever it works. but don't think it's some sort of magic panacea that you can suddenly start zapping your way out of the problem of Russian state aggression, Chinese state aggression, and so forth. It's just a tool. Cyber is not a boxing ring. It's not an American football field with offense versus defense. It's just another part of everyday life in war and peace. It's another capability. It's a defensive requirement, and it's an offensive tool for use in appropriate circumstances. It is not some sort of magic way out of this problem, and we shouldn't think of it like that.
I agree completely with Ciaran. I'm going to say, though, the difference between a liberal Western democracy having access to offensive cyber tools and their use in war and all those other things, I think the decisions upon how those things are used and the legal frameworks that we require for their use are just so much. I was going to say the word burdensome, but burdensome is the wrong word. It's just more controlled. So you won't see the UK. I thought the UK's response to the horrendous, Novichok issue was a classic example of a good way to respond, which is you don't lower yourself to what the enemy has done.
You're talking about the Salisbury poisonings
Yes.
of a former Russian.
Yes, absolutely.
Intelligence official.
So, but the same, I think, to Ciaran's point, that you've got to do the same thing with this stuff. I want to pick up on I think a really important point you made when we were talking about pre-positioning on critical infrastructure, Ciaran. In order to spy, to conduct espionage, which no one likes someone else doing it to you, but it's kind of what nations do, particularly competing nations. You've got to have access into systems. If you've got access into systems, you can then do other disruptive things to them if you then want to. So to his point, you can find a bit of code. The bit of code might be just for the purposes of getting access and doing a smash and grab and stealing some sensitive information. Could be eventually to shut down a system. Where we saw China acting really irresponsibly, was on that the Microsoft Exchange server issue, where they created a problem which was then piled in on by criminals. And that's the type of thing also where you see, you can create a vulnerability, you can exploit it for your national purposes, which is, I'm going to say in quotes, legitimate, which might sound weird to some people watching, but it's irresponsible if you allow that exploit to become, a vector for people who don't put filters on, because even nation states even those who want to do us, in quotes, harm, put filters over their actions.
Well, there's a joke.
Does that make sense?
There's a joke that Stuxnet, the code looked like it had been written in some sense by a bunch of DC lawyers to imply that necessity, proportionality, all of these things we use when we're talking about using kinetic attacks, also liberal democracies will apply them when using.
They will apply them.
Cyber.
And absolutely, they will apply that same degree of, a military lawyer and a minister signing off and all those other things, which I think is fundamentally different to criminals, because every criminal I've met in the last 30 years does not get permission for what they do. That's why they're criminals, right? They don't they don't do a damage assessment, of what they've done. They don't worry about sort of unintended collateral consequences, which all of our militaries will and our intelligence agencies will. They just, in fact, harm's built into their business model. I say it at least 5 times a day. Some of these nation states, I think, act irresponsibly, and I think our countries have got better at calling those things out. And it all blends, right, into a sort of a threat for. And I'll go back to Ciaran's point. I know I'm stealing your time, so I'll stop in a second, like 10 or so minutes.
To listen to you
10
both.
or so minutes, but is. You then go back to this privatisation of decision making that Ciaran made. You've got nation states acting, and they will target private entities. We know that. Yeah, we see it. We respond to those incidents as an organisation, both public sector organisations and private. And criminals act, and yet these decisions for what you do to it are done at the company level, which is really weird, to Ciaran's point. And I think it shows you how far we've got to drag this discussion and debate into what are our societal responses. Look, I'm a glass half full guy. I say that at least 5 times a day, as you know. I feel pity for you having to hear it so often. But I'm a glass half full guy. I think the fact that we're even having these discussions, if I look at where this industry's come from and I look at where I think it's heading to, I think we'll solve these things. We'll end up with this being a vector, a threat vector, and a significant one, but one that we kind of wrap our arms around.
You mentioned, Alastair, the Microsoft Exchange attacks, which, as you said, was relatively irresponsible as far as cyber activity goes. So we saw almost a smash and grab where we had the intelligence services of China engaging in certain activity and then leaving the door open for a whole range of other characters, criminal and otherwise, to come in and piggyback on that. And the Australian government joined with a range of other governments and international organisations in calling out China for that attack. It was only the second time that Australia's actually named China in relation to cyber activity.
Yep.
So my question then for you is, to what extent does, let's call it, naming and shaming matter in this space? And a follow-up question, if I can be so bold, it was a multilateral attribution there that Australia got in on. As far as I'm aware, Australia has never stood up by itself and pointed the finger at a hostile nation state when it comes to cyber activities. So where does it leave us? Say the Australian Parliament is hit, or say, for instance, an Australian institution like a university is hit. Hypothetically speaking,
yeah.
But it only affects Australia. So we're not going to get our Five Eyes partners and others on board in a multilateral attribution statement because it affects Australia. It's not a global cyber attack. Yeah. So part one is, does naming and shaming matter? But part two is also, does Australia, or could you foresee the circumstances where Australia might need to go it alone when it comes to attributions, or should we always just wait when a multilateral one is available for us to jump on board with?
Right. So do they have an effect? Yes. The question is how much of an effect, I suspect. The answer is not a lot, but it does start defining sort of the rules of the road. Because again, as nations, we've not been good necessarily at defining what actions should be. And I think it matters to China if they're called out by a whole heap of countries. And just from memory, that wasn't just sort of the usual sort of Western countries, that was, Japan was on that list. I mean, everyone does a slightly different statement, as you know, right? So people like me are going to sort of, because I'm not as sophisticated as you, will just say, well, Japan was on side. NATO, I think for the first time ever, named China, and there you go, and on and on it went. So it was a pretty interesting list of countries. It wasn't just Australia and the US and the UK going naughty China. It was a long list of countries, and I think to the credit of those who brought that international coalition together. I think it's always more effective when more than one country makes a statement, because it starts creating that sort of world response to this. The cynic in me says it doesn't do a lot to change states who kind of say, well, what are the consequences? As a small power, one I'm really proud to be part of, but one that doesn't have a huge amount of leverage. I understand why we don't go out on our own always. We, as you know, and I know the way you asked the question, our parliament has been impacted. I got to stand up and try to explain how and why a couple of times actually, which is always fun. And our universities, several, have been impacted by nation states, sophisticated nation state threat actors, and we don't name them. We would say the government line, I'd be really keen to hear Ciaran's view, was the government line is we choose to name when we choose to name and when we believe it's in Australia's national interest. And I actually get that. I understand it. I understand the invidious situation government is in here, because part of it is just the espionage game. And again, my job and Ciaran's job was to reduce the likelihood of that effectiveness of those campaigns run by other governments. And a lot of the time you lose.
When you say it's just the espionage game, when we're talking ye olde espionage, the targets are elites, potentially officials, those who've kind of engaged in the espionage.
Right, and then you're saying, what about ANU students? And what about our parliamentarians?
Is that just the espionage game?
No,
or is that something that's qualitatively different?
It absolutely is, and I'm not trying to trivialize it. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's and it sounds like I'm fobbing you off. It's nuanced, right? I understand why nation states don't. I'm, as you know, a little bit hawkish on this stuff, in a good traditional way, rather than some of the ways you might read about it online. I know Ciaran may not always agree with me on some of this stuff. I'd like to see us name more. I'd like us just to call it out when we see it and we kind of have confidence as a country. But I actually understand why we don't a lot of the time. if it's China, and let's call out, I've mentioned China several times, and I'm not China bashing. I'm certainly not China population bashing, but the Chinese intelligence agencies are a competitor. And they don't have Australia's best interests at heart. They've got the Chinese Communist Party's best interest at heart, and through that they would say the Chinese people. I disagree. I'm not in China, and I respect the role the MSS plays in doing what they think is right. I'm a patriot of Australia. I like to defend us against those actions. So, are they effective? Calling it out, yes and no. They take a long time. If you want to start accusing, sorry for my long answer, and you think I'm avoiding it, I'm not avoiding it. It's if you, as a nation state, to point a finger at another nation state and say, you went and did this to us, you really want to have your evidence ducks in a row.
And of course, it's not always just China as well. So
no.
I think
I'm naming China because we often are too scared to, which is the point of your question. Ciaran, get me out of here.
Well, firstly, I wouldn't get hung up on the fact that Australia's never attributed alone. I might be wrong, but I don't think the UK has ever attributed alone. And I think that's by choice. I think we prefer doing it with international partners because insofar as it carries any weight at all, and I'll come on to that point, it carries more weight with international partners, even if it's an incident that affects the UK. Other countries, notably the close neighbour here and ally France, never attribute. They don't think it works. They prefer to make protestations in private. I think that's a legitimate policy choice. But like Alastair, I think it's again not a panacea. There's no single panacea for any of this stuff, but it can be a useful contributory factor to an overall response that will have some impact. I think in terms of the big four hostile states that the UK and other allies care about, broadly speaking, experience shows it has more impact on China and Iran than it does on Russia and North Korea. For a variety of reasons, the Russian state tends to be impervious to this sort of criticism when it's the foundation for indictments, which the US does frequently. Chinese hackers tend to be irritated at the West being closed off to them. Same for Iranians, Russians, perhaps not so much. Big place, patronage of the state and so forth. North Korea, similarly, they're not going to be taking holidays in Western Europe. China in the past, the 2015 agreements between Xi and Obama are a good example of this. They're not perfect and they're basically dead now, but they bought a couple of years of quieter commercial espionage activity, and that was more useful than not doing it. There's actually another thing, which is that there is a thing around public confidence and not taking our own domestic populations for fools. They know this stuff's going on. And I've been in front of TV cameras, Alastair's been in front of TV cameras. And, if you say, right, so there's been a major compromise of a private company and the sort of thing you're talking about beyond the traditional great game of espionage, and people are really worried. If you're asked who did it, and you say you don't know, and sometimes you don't know, that's a really awkward position. And if you say, well, we don't know, but we're not telling you. I mean, people aren't fools. They think, well, why aren't you telling us? And then if you say, well, it's China, what are you going to do about it? I think people understand the reasonable limitations of the responses of a Western liberal democracy. No, we're not going to go to war over this. We're not going to attack civilians, but we are going to try and do, a moderately useful set of pushbacks to show that we've noticed, we care, we understand this, and we will try to make it harder and inflict some. Impose some costs, if you like to use the phrase that, although I dislike it, it's widely used. So attribution is, I don't think it's ever harmful to attribute. It's occasionally useless and it's sometimes useful. So I don't see I think to say, well, attribution doesn't solve the problem, therefore why do it, is the wrong question. It's a contributory part in some cases, so let's do it when it makes sense.
It can be the prelude to further action, I suppose. It's worth noting that just last week, Australia's Parliament unanimously passed Magnitsky-style laws that would potentially sanction a range of human rights abusers, but also cyber criminals as well. So it's kind of a space to watch, perhaps, to see if Australia starts taking that next step against both cyber criminal and potentially nation-state hackers as well.
I hope so. If it just becomes, it's just another tool. It's another legal tool, and congratulations to to the parliament for doing it. I can understand the pressures of not doing it. Again, as a small nation.
Medium, we describe
medium,
ourselves as
I know. Well,
top 20 economy, medium power.
Okay, look at you
regional leader.
You're better read than I am. I'm going to call us a small nation. I mean, the fact is we've got to take a moral stand on some of these things because some things really matter. You know, the genesis of that act and the global action there was a horrendous, again, state-sanctioned piece of torture that led to death. You know, and again, we got to, as a nation, take a stand. It's what matters. I mean, Ciaran, well, all of us have spent our lives trying to protect people against wrongness, right? Which is not you'll correct me, I know. I shouldn't work with you so often because I'll start correcting my own language if I'm not careful. The reality is we've got to stand up for what's right. We actually do. And it matters. And so, yes, I hope it's just another tool that we have as a nation to act. I hope when it comes to matters of internet badness, we act and we see it as egregious and we take action. And I think we should do similar things with human rights abuses. Absolutely.
I want to expand the conversation in the last couple of minutes. Ciaran, you mentioned that 2015 pact between Xi Jinping and President Obama, which ostensibly said we'll stop stealing IP from each other. And we know that history, I mean, the genesis of that was the greatest transfer of wealth in history, where the US felt that as a range of cyber attacks against them, that they'd lost so much of their IP and so much economic value. We know that 2015 pact perhaps didn't go so well in terms of stamping out IP theft. In fact, potentially it got a little bit better and more acute. My question, starting with you, Ciaran, is we have critical technology on the agenda. So in Australia, or the government just put out a critical technology blueprint identifying 63 critical technologies that are essential to our future and our security, and 9 we'll focus on in the short term. And I know in the UK, the head of MI6 just gave his first public remarks the other week, also emphasising the incredible importance of technological leadership and not ceding that to countries like China. When it comes to thinking about critical technology more broadly, not just cybersecurity, do we have our policy settings right at the moment? Is this focus on technological leadership the right way to be going? And how far are we from actually, as the UK, as Australia, actually getting back on track in this space?
So yes, it's the right policy focus. It's existential. It's first order importance, maybe second only to climate change in terms of the future of free and open democracies. We're miles away from where we need to be, but I'm going to be quite forgiving about that. It's a whole different. It's another hour. It's another day, of discussion, and it goes way beyond cybersecurity. So everything we've been talking about to date is kind of messing around and cheating on America's internet, right? The internet that was largely built in the west coast of the US. And back in the 90s, we would lecture the Chinese and we'd say, this is an existential threat to your authoritarian, totalitarian regime, because you're not going to get 500 million, and in the fullness of time, 1.5 billion sophisticated internet users and keep them all quiet and so forth. Now, the Chinese have proved that absolutely wrong. They've got way past the stage where modern communications technology is a threat to the regime, and they've actually harnessed it to entrench power. Now they're kicking on. As Alastair said, it's an objective. If you're working for the Chinese Communist Party, it makes perfect sense, using that giant domestic market, the subsidies, the technological skills in China to build, to try in the Made in China 2025 strategy to build technological leadership over the West in these key technologies. Responding to that is a really, really hard problem. The advantages we've got are the innovation that open markets and free societies bring. The disadvantages are that it's really hard to do scaled industrial policy, even within giant countries like the United States, let alone, a Western alliance of the US, the EU, countries like the UK, Australia, Japan, and so on. So it comes back to, another G7 declaration, an even more important one than the ransomware one, where there's this commitment, and it's a policy commitment. The challenge is, this isn't really a security policy question. If it was If Alastair and I were back in our old jobs and it was the ransomware declaration, you have the G7 agreement. You then, you remit it. You don't have a NATO. If it was defence, you'd have NATO, say, and you'd have a bunch of defence ministries. But in cybersecurity, you'd have the ACSC, the NCSC in the UK. We'd all get together. We're used to cooperating with each other. We trust each other. We have mechanisms, established mechanisms for sharing information. We can do something. That doesn't exist in this economic and trade and innovation policy sphere, for good reason, because we all fairly and openly compete with each other in these markets. So how do you do that? And that is a really, really difficult problem. So everything, in the interest of time, will be quick, but everything you've described in Australia, it's specific to Australian context, but it's very similar to the direction of policy in the UK. It's similar to the direction of rhetoric in the US and the EU, not yet policy, aligning all of those. So you have, the technospheres, the two technospheres are diverging. There's no doubt about that. They're going to look very, very different. How does the Western one sustain a free, effective industrial base that's secure but still free and open and can outcompete that other model is the biggest question, I think, facing us now, and it goes way beyond cybersecurity.
We've got 2/3 represented of the Orcas agreement here, the agreement between Australia, the UK and the US on matters including technology sharing. I'll go to you, Alastair, first. Is Orcas the type of vehicle that Ciaran's talking about where we can start to put aside economic competition towards something more cooperative? And if so, what's the low-hanging fruit? What do we need to focus on now for technological leadership?
Wow. Short answer is yes, because I think Orcas is a good declaration of sort of a security alliance technology transfer sort of industrial thing. I think it was pretty amorphous, right? I mean, many of us wanted to see more detail and still do about what it means for industry, for example, between the three countries. It's a great, when we first talked about this, I loved Ciaran's discussion about how we just fiercely compete, right? I want to see Australian businesses sell to the UK, quite proudly and to compete with the world, including, by the way, Chinese companies, there's no doubt. But it's interesting where you then get to this point of what happens if some are state preferenced in one place where you might have transferred illegally that IP to start with, and then you've built upon that IP, and I acknowledge they've built upon a lot of that IP, and then try to sell it back in a subsidized way in a free market. It's a really interesting dynamic. So do I think Orcas could help? Yes. It shouldn't just be, and I know it's not going to be, just bureaucrats traveling between three capitals that they often travel between anyway, right? The nuclear submarine technologies, I know it upset the French, I acknowledge that, but the concept of us being able to access that type of technology, I think, is really important strategically for us as part of our defence posture. I'd love to see some type of policy work between the three capitals about how to encourage private sector organisations to cooperate, whether it's protection of, if you do one in one, and again, I'm no legal or trade expert, you do one thing in one country, it's regarded as if it was done in the others for legal protections and recognising laws. But then we've got conflict of laws, right? So the UK might be closer to the EU for certain things about privacy than we would be, for example. That can be to our detriment when it comes to some trade. In fact, a lot of trade. We might want the Cloud Act in the US might want them to recognise us so we can get access for security and law enforcement reasons to data, which would then preclude us being able to deal with perhaps the UK or Western Europe without the UK, because they sit there and say that's tantamount to having the Americans have access to their data if they share it with us. So it's really complex. I haven't answered your question. I'd like to see, as a company, we proudly have a presence, of course, in the UK and the US, and in New Zealand, who is not part of Orcas, at least, unless they sort of said they were partly, right?
Orcas doesn't sound
right? No, it doesn't sound as good. It's a really, I guess I'd say it's complex.
Complex and nuanced.
It is, but cybersecurity, if I go back to that and the cybersecurity technologies that we need, I can certainly see us sharing better on those. Ciaran, what's your view on that? after I've butchered
Well,
it.
I'll be quick because the village clock here in the UK has just struck midnight, so I don't want to turn into a pumpkin. But I was going to, so I think, so Orcas clearly born out of submarine requirements, of which I know nothing. So I'm not going to comment on that. So I think the test is, so I approve of it. I agree with the point about France might have been better handled, but because it's an important ally. But I think in 10 years' time, the subs will be whatever happens in the decades that it takes to deliver these things. Will the technological thing be a bit of window dressing that has led to various summits and exchanges of papers and so forth, or will it have been that a kernel for the development of a really smart strategy that allows the competitive element to flourish and the innovation that strengthens us to flourish, but at the same time thinks about how we avoid getting into those catastrophic situations like we were with 5G, where the Western infrastructure market's been decimated, where we really managed our imprint in strategic technologies, where we've managed to contain the sort of unfair subsidized competition that Alastair's talked about. And I think it's a really, really difficult problem because the answers to those questions are not going to be found in national security establishments. So how broad's that bit of AUKUS that's talking about cyber, that's talking about technologies? Where is the private sector? Where are the inventors? Where are the scientists and so on? I think is going to be where the people who can commercialize it at scale. I think that's where it needs to go. It's going to be difficult, but it has to succeed. Probably also it has to be broadened at some point.
You're kind of looking at the time and potential to turn into a pumpkin, Ciaran, but I hope you'll forgive me if I ask one final question, because
They've muted you.
we've had a very somber discussion today. There's been a lot of mention of the word existential coupled with the word threat, and so I wanted to widen out the conversation and end on potentially a slightly happier note, which is to ask both of you for your holiday reading recommendations for what you would, and I don't mean what you're going to read on the beach, Alastair, I mean something that you have found compelling in shaping your thinking on cybersecurity or any of the topics we've had today, public policy, critical technology, leadership. So I can see your thinking, and I'm going to quickly go over to Ciaran and give him the guest privilege to go
he's going to answer.
first.
Go on, Ciaran.
And I genuinely mean this because I said to begin with that you two are two of the doyens of cybersecurity, and I'm sure whoever is listening today will very much appreciate your recommendations.
All right, so I'll give you three. So one, just given the topic, is it's called Ransomware. It's by a guy called Alan Liska, and it's about practical responses to ransomware. It's just out. He's brilliant on Twitter. He calls himself the ransomware sommelier, which is a concept that beggars belief. So that's one for the here and now. The second, to be optimistic about this for people with a general interest in this, but it doesn't drive their lives. It's a lovely book by a British woman called Jessica Barker called Confident Cybersecurity. And it's just, look, fine. You don't have to worry about a lot of the stuff, the geopolitical stuff that Alastair and I and you, Katherine, have been talking about for the last hour. But actually, if you're worried about this, here's how to demystify it. Here's some practical things you can do in your organization. But actually a bit of beach reading, although nobody's going to the beach in this part of the world at this time of year, because it is basically a thriller, although it's true. And it's 30 years old, is The Cuckoo's Egg by Cliff Stoll, because it's the basic concepts of cyber hacking. It's about him uncovering as a student, due to a 75-cent accounting error in the old computer rooms, for those old enough to remember university computer rooms, where he traces it back to a massive Soviet Union, not Russian, Soviet Union espionage attack on the US, with things like login being guessed, password being password, and this is at US military installations, but it tells you it's timeless, at least insofar as the digital world is concerned. So, and it's a brilliant read.
Oh, he's so much more sophisticated than me. I'm going to say two things. Well, three. I'm going
Okay.
to read Ciaran's Brookings piece because you're much more widely read than I am. Nigel Fair just put out a book on cybercrime here, and his analysis is interesting. Nigel and I don't always agree, but he's done an interesting analysis on the conflict of laws here, how we haven't harmonised laws. We run a system of states and territories, of course, and a Commonwealth here. The amount of cybercrime and the lack of success in a lot of the the projection of police power into the online space. So that's worth looking at. That's on, you can order it on the internet. And I'm going to reread Dune, because the movie's out. I like science fiction, right? And I think the reason, and so, that sounds more trivial than I actually am. I think science fiction is one of the best ways for us to start thinking about how to deal with a lot of the issues that we come across, and, trade wars and all those other bits. And I want to see the movie. And I was talking to one of my sons the other day who'd reread all of the books before he saw the movie. So
it's a competitive
I thought I would do that. He's more motivated than I am, but that's my answer.
Thank you so much, Ciaran Martin, Alastair MacGibbon, for joining us on today's Cyber Dialogue. It's been an absolutely thrilling ride. I've learned a lot, and I've got more questions than I had before. But thank you very much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing both of you back. Ciaran, hopefully in Australia at some point, and Alastair, you're always here. We're looking forward to engaging with you more over the years ahead. So thank you very much, both.
Thanks, Katherine. Thanks, Alastair. Thank you.
See you, Ciaran. Go to bed.
I will. Thank you. Good night.